Femininity by Susan Brownmiller, Chapter 6, Movement, Part 2. I was taught to sit with my knees close together, but I don't remember if I was given a reason. Somewhere along the way, I heard that boys liked to look up girls' skirts and that it was our job to keep them from seeing our panties, but I didn't put much stock into this vicious slur. Quote-unquote, put your knees together seemed to be a rule of good posture, like sit up straight, and nothing more. As with other things that became entrenched in my mind as unquestionably right and feminine, when I thought about it later on, I could find an aesthetic reason. The line of a skirt did seem more graceful when the knees weren't poking out in different directions. Slanting them together was the way to avoid looking slovenly in a chair. Sitting with the legs crossed became an acceptably feminine posture only after skirts were shortened in the 1920s. Bending over to pick up a piece of paper was fraught with the danger of indecent exposure during the 60s miniskirt era, and like other women who believed the minis looked terrifically dashing when we stepped along the street, I had to think twice, compose myself, and slither down with closed knees if I dropped something. A breed of voyeurs known as staircase watchers made their appearance during this interesting time. Slowly, it dawned on me that much of feminine movement, the inhibited gestures, the locked knees, the nervous adjustments of the skirt, was a defensive maneuver against immodest, vulgar display that feminine clothing flirted with in deliberate provocation. My feminine responsibility was to keep both aspects, the provocative and the chaste, in careful balance, even if it meant avoiding the beautifully designed open stairway in a certain Fifth Avenue bookshop. But why did I think of vulgarity when the focal point at issue, I could no longer deny the obvious, was my very own crotch? Why did I believe that if I switched to trousers, the problem would be magically solved? Spreading the legs is a biologically crucial, characteristically female act. Not only does the female have the anatomical capacity to stretch her legs farther apart than the average male because of the shape of her pelvis, but a generous amount of leg spread is necessary to the act of sexual intercourse, to the assertive demand for pleasure, and to the act of giving birth. There may have been a time in history when this female posture was celebrated with pride and joy. I am thinking of the Minoan frescoes on Crete, where women were shown leaping with ease over the horns of a charging bull. The sexual symbolism of the woman and the bull has been remarked upon by others. But in civilizations as we know it, female leg spread is identified with loose, wanton behavior, pornographic imagery, promiscuity, moral laxity, immodest demeanor, and a lack of refinement. In other words, with qualities that the feminine woman must try to avoid, even as she must try to hint that somewhere within her repertoire such possibilities exist. Capacious female leg spread is fundamental to copulation and sexual pleasure, as routine as the mounting procedure is for the male. In fact, a female leg spread must occur first in the natural order of things if sexual activity is going to take place. By contrast, there is nothing hidden about the male sexual organ. It is a manifest presence. The legs need not spread to reveal it, nor are they usually positioned as wide apart as the females to accommodate the sexual act. But while copulation and other genital activity require a generous spread of the thighs in order for a woman to achieve her pleasure, in the feminine code of behavior, she is not supposed to take the initiative out of her own desire. Her feminine task is to keep her legs firmly together in the name of modesty and chastity, to guard her quote-unquote hidden treasure, while waiting for the one right man, her lawful husband, her persistent lover, to wave the magic wand and perform the ritual of open sesame. His volition and his action are expected to take precedence over hers. Initiative is the issue, and the feminine code of movement is designed to inhibit the thought. The ideology of feminine sexual passivity relies on a pair of closed thighs more intently than it does upon speculative theories of the effects of testosterone on the libido, aggression, and the human brain. Open thighs acknowledge female sexuality as a positive, assertive force, a force that is capable of making demands to achieve satisfaction. Students of Japanese history know that samurai warriors trained their daughters in the use of weapons to give them the requisite skills to commit harikiri when force was disgraced. As part of the training, girls were taught how to tie their lower limbs securely so they would not embarrass themselves and their family by inadvertently assuming an immodest position in the agony of death. Traditional Japanese etiquette pays close attention to the rules of modest posture for women. In the classic squat position for eating, men are permitted to open their knees a few inches for comfort, but women are not. Men may also sit cross-legged on the floor, but women must kneel with their legs together. Throughout Asia during the Middle Ages, women were carried in a litter. Women were either carried in a litter when they journeyed a long distance, or they rode on horseback, straddling the animal and directing the movements like a typical male rider. The ladylike custom of perching sideways, which required a groom to hold the reins and lead the way, and its variation, riding pillion, on a cushioned seat behind a male rider, were conventions that arose in medieval Europe. The demure sideways perch appealed to generations of artists who chose the flight into Egypt as a favorite theme. In this popular genre of Holy Family portraits, Mary cradles the infant Jesus in her arms as mother and son are solemnly borne on a donkey led by Joseph. Exceptional women like Joan of Arc and Diane de Poitiers plainly straddled their mounts with vigor and skill, but conventional ladies restricted their riding to ceremonial occasions and some pleasant outings in the fresh air, and they rode quote-unquote aside with their legs together. For its part, the patient horse could do little more than walk in a measured gait under the precarious burden of its lopsided load. Catherine de' Medici, who is credited with popularizing the corset, is also thought to have devised that ingenious feminine compromise, the side saddle. According to one historian of horsemanship, quote, she discovered it was safer than sitting sideways, and more seemly than sitting astride, to hook her right knee around the high pommel of a man's saddle. It was an obvious development to move the pommel a few inches to the left, so as to hold the rider's leg in a secure and comfortable grip, end quote. With variations and refinements, riding side saddle persisted into the 20th century when the suffrage movement, trail riding in the American West, and the acceptance of riding breeches eased its decline. The side saddle was popular for many reasons. Women were not believed to have enough strength in their thighs to straddle a horse and maintain a good grip. Their legs were too short, their backs were too weak, and a sustained bumping on the groin was not only indelicate, it might also be injurious. In the words of Charles Chevenet-Tranche, a horseman's historian, quote, moreover, the rounded contours of females were considered inelegant when riding astride. Put bluntly, their bottoms were too big, end quote. But with the left leg dangling in a normal stirrup, the right leg crossed over to the left side of the horse, both legs covered by the drape of a skirt, the view from the rear was asymmetrical and charming. The rider's legs were as close together as they could be, and pleasurable contact between groin and saddle was deftly avoided. It remained for the feminine student of equestrian to compensate for the uneven distribution of her weight on the left side of the horse by lifting her left hip and bearing down hard on her right, while she twisted her torso to keep facing front. When mounting or dismounting, 2 attendants were usually required, a groom to hold the reins and a gentleman cavalier to lift her into and out of the saddle while she modestly arranged her skirts. All of this accomplished, a lady could ride and not look or feel like a man. She could even manage a small jump and a canter. She tired more easily than her male companions because of the uneven stress and strain on her muscles, but ladies were expected to tire and not be as strong as men. The important thing was that she had preserved her femininity on horseback at the expense of being a one-legged rider. Prior to the 20th century, the athletic woman was required to accept a multiplicity of handicaps that reduced the efficiency of her natural coordination and made her specially vulnerable to injury from accidental spills and awkward, humiliating falls. Riding in side saddle, ice skating in long skirts, swimming in stockings and bloomers, bicycling in furbelows, playing badminton in corsets, she gamely struggles to keep her balance while preserving a modest deportment. It was not simply that love of sports was somewhat mannish and suspect. She believed her body housed reproductive organs that were morbidly delicate and debilitating by nature. One of her concerns was uterine protection. In the obsessive Victorian preoccupation with quote-unquote the feminine sphere, partial invalidism and bodily frailty were assumed to be the female's natural state, unless the female was a servant or a factory worker. A lady's pregnancy was tantamount to an illness that demanded a lengthy confinement, and menstruation was viewed as a chronic sickness that could best be treated by inactivity and bed rest. In the words of Heinrich and English, authors of For Her Own Good, quote, medicine had discovered that female functions were inherently pathological, end quote. In these doctors' defense, the authors continue, quote, women of 100 years ago were, in some ways, sicker than women of today. Quite apart from tight lacing, arsenic nipping, and fashionable cases of neurasthenia, women faced certain bodily risks which men did not share, end quote. Chief among these was maternal mortality. But beyond the very real risk of death in childbirth, proof of the morbid, sickly state of the uterus was seen in the monthly flow of blood, and there is little evidence that women differed with their doctors in this perception. The effects of menstruation on mobility has been underrated by those who seek to explain why men evolved as far-ranging hunters while women preferred to gather the fruits and seeds and stay closer to home. Childbearing, nursing, and a limited musculature obviously combine to determine the historic direction of gender-related roles, but menstrual blood itself may also have been a significant factor. With lions, it is the female who does 90% of the hunting. Among cheetahs, the female, not the male, ranges far and wide across vast stretches of land. Female rats, as well, are more exploratory and fearless than males and roam over a wider range. There seems to be nothing in femaleness per se, nothing in being the sex that bears and cares for the young that handicaps movement in the lower species. But higher on the evolutionary ladder, the estrogen-dominant reproductive system grows increasingly complex and seemingly more burdensome. Some other primates have menstrual cycles, but only the human female is subject to a copious flow of blood that needs to be stanched by external means. How did they respond to their periods, those Pleistocene ancestors of ours, those hominid precursors along the track to Homo sapiens? At what point in human evolution, at what stage in the development of what goes under the rubric of early man, did early woman discover that she had a bloody problem at those times of the lunar cycle? In what eon of prehistory did her menstrual flow increase from an insignificant trickle to an alarming rush down her thighs? Did she grab a handful of leaves and stuff them into her vagina? Were animals attracted to her smell? Did she suffer from cramps? Did she think that something was dreadfully wrong? Because of frequent impregnation, continuous nursing, nutritional deficiencies, and the daily stress of staying alive, the menstrual cycle must have been irregular as a matter of course in the prehistoric age, but irregular or not, with a profuse effluence of blood, it was dramatically immobilizing in comparison to other primate species and especially in comparison to the carefree reproductive system of the human male. Menstruation, gestation, childbirth, and nursing the young were a continuum of physiological reasons for avoiding the big hunt among other foraging peoples whose chief sources of food were roots, seeds, and fruit. The female's fertility, her awesome periodicity, and the fertility of the land were connected in the earliest goddess myth. The connection was real. Primitive menstrual taboos were not necessarily a male invention. Seclusion in a menstrual hut, avoidance of sex and of men in general, and a relief from agricultural and cooking labors were pragmatic ways of dealing with cramps and a copious flow. In a practical sense, menstrual taboos meant time off on those days when a woman had reason to feel unclean, unwell, immobilized, and curse. Depending on what was available in a given climate, a variety of porous fibers were used, and still are used in most countries, to stanch the monthly blood. Makeshift padding of roots and husks, homemade tampons of wadded paper, cotton or wool, and reusable diapers fashioned from folded lengths of heavy cloth. The shameful, bulky menstrual rags of my grandmother's generation that were furtively scrubbed in cold water and left to dry in a secret place. Quote unquote, the rag persisted as the routine, cumbersome method of sanitary protection in advanced Western society till the 1920s, when rolls of gauze and cellulose fiber developed for bandaging wounds during World War I were cut to standard size and sold commercially in the United States. The marketing of disposable pads, with the acknowledgement of quote unquote the hygiene handicap and quote unquote the days a woman used to lose. These quotes are from a full-page ad for Kotex that appeared in the elegant front section of Vogue in 1926. Coincided not accidentally with such changes in fashion as the abandonment of the full-length corset, the shortening and slimming of the skirts, and a new eager interest in trousers. Throwaway absorbent tampons with no extraneous belts, loops, safety pins, bulky shape, or revealing outline, which truly afforded normal freedom of movement on quote unquote those days, included swimming, did not reach the market until 1933. In Menstruation and Menopause, Paula Wiedger had written that the physical reality of menstruation is not considered an attribute of femininity, but rather, quote, a fall from feminine grace, end quote. While a woman with irregular periods may suffer from the belief that she is quote unquote not feminine enough, and while a woman in menopause may associate the end of her childbearing years with a quote unquote loss of feminine, there is another worrisome concern that occurs 13 times a year for more than 35 years if one is on an average 28-day cycle. The menstrual flow, despite its testament to female fertility and to gender, runs diametrically counter to the prized feminine virtues of neatness and order and a dainty, sweet, and clean appearance. Put squarely, menstruation is a nasty inconvenience, no matter how positive one's feelings are toward having children. Cut through the menstrual taboos and their primitive origins, and menstruation is still a nasty inconvenience. Brush aside the abhorrence of some men at the thought of a menstruating woman, and menstruation remains a nasty inconvenience, a dripping, bloating, congestive mess. Even the periodicity itself, the inexorable regularity of a cycle that runs like clockwork, is an order of disorder, a disruption of the everyday routine, an imposition of cautious caretaker concerns. Secure protection, check against leakage, carry the extra tampon, change the pad, or suffer the mortification of the drip, the gush, and the stain. This quote unquote untidy event, as Simone de Beauvoir called it, forces women to pay minute attention to the inner workings of their body in a way that men find difficult to comprehend. A healthy system must be monitored and managed, and the concentration on details cannot be avoided or put off for another hour, for the consequences will be public embarrassment, a telltale odor, and a pile of soiled clothes. It is hardly feminine or polite to stain the back of one's skirt or the bed sheets and mattress, even though the oozing blood is normal and female, indeed, is a prime example of biological femaleness in its reproductive role. Neither is it desirably feminine to be besieged by a monthly eruption of pimples, lank hair, a bloated stomach, painful tenderness in the breast, dull cramps, irritability, and tension. As Beauvoir remarked, quote, "It is not easy to play the idol, the fairy, the faraway princess when one feels a bloody cloth between one's legs, and more generally when one is conscious of the primitive misery of being a body." End quote. It is not either It is not easy, either, to play the jock with a bloody cloth between one's legs, and at the critical moment in adolescence, when the young boy revels in his developing musculature, the girl may appear at school with a note that excuses her from gym. To swim or not to swim, to run or not to run, to take the calisthenics class or to skip it, to go ahead with plans for the week-long camping trip or to try and switch the date of departure, taking into account the solemn warning of the calendar. Menstruation asserts itself as a negative force to be overcome by the physically active woman. Even for those with an easy period, feeling loggy or lethargic is not unusual. The proverbial note to the gym teacher, the female biological exemption, resides in the back of the head as a possible option. Grace Lichtenstein, who wrote a book about professional tennis, acquired enough evidence to report, quote, "Menstrual cramps are literally the curse of the women's circuit," end quote. And more than one championship player, she noted, was dashed off the court in mid-game for a change of tampons. The 20th century female athlete has placed herself on the cutting edge of some of the most perplexing problems of gender-related biology and the feminine ideal. Although she exercises to build up her body, while other women still exercise to slim down theirs, she may never break the international record set by male athletes in most events because of the genetic limits of her musculature. Her breasts and hips are no asset in running and sprinting. She will move more efficiently with a figure that is quote unquote boyish. Loose flowing hair, that trusty feminine emblem of such strong, fleet maidens as Atlanta and the Valkyries, must remain in the realm of myth for the real life track stars. Beautiful free hair would only slow her down and get in her eyes. Even a normal manifestation of strenuous exertion, like working up a good sweat, runs counter to a feminine image. How to look feminine while competing is a problem that haunts the psyche of the American female athlete. High school coaches regularly complain that their best girl runners show up at the track wearing heavy bracelets and dangling earrings, and championship tennis players work to improve their on-court image with mascara, eyeshadow, and designer dresses. At times of mental conflict, at times, the mental conflict spills over into highly defensive verbal expression. An American Olympic swimmer groused bitterly to the press that the unfeminine big shoulders of the East German woman who beat her in the water. A champion runner took to wearing a t-shirt that proclaimed, quote unquote, "I'm a lady first, I'm an athlete second." The ambivalence of these athletes is rooted in cultural expectations, for while we have come a long way from the time when riding a bicycle was considered dangerous to the female constitution, the track and field star knows that her sweaty tank top does not fit the conventional image of glamour, and the swimmer understands that a poolside bathing beauty in a striking bikini cuts a sexier figure than the rubber-capped winner of the 400-meter freestyle event. On a more disturbing level, how can a female athlete not wonder what femaleness means when a male tennis player undergoes surgery, hormone treatments, electrolysis, and a change of name and a hairstyle, and is permitted to play on the women's circuit? How can she not be suspicious of a remarkable new record when some Olympic champion, a beefy Russian shot putter, and a couple of Polish sprinters were found to possess congenital chromosomal abnormalities, an irregular mix of male and female characteristics that gave them a surprising advantage of strength and speed in competition with true genetic women? What does a young gymnast think when she hears the Romanian national coach put his tiny 14-year-old star on a diet of salad, apples, and brake drugs in an attempt to retard her bodily changes? How can a runner, a swimmer, or ballerina not worry when, though through hard training, a reduction of body fat, and the effects of stress, her menstrual cycle may temporarily cease to function? Biology confronts the woman athlete at every step. For little that is female and nothing that is feminine aids in the performance of someone who wants to win, except in those events where style and grace are judged subjectively on points. Despite anatomical flexibility, women are generally less relaxed than men in their body postures, according to the studies of Albert Meridian, who proposes the attitudes of submissiveness are conveyed through posture of tension. In Meridian's analysis of body language among high and low status males, high ranking men are more relaxed in their gestures in the presence of subordinates. Not surprisingly, men of all ranks generally assume more relaxed postures and gestures when communicating with women. Merabian's studies correlate with the work of zoologist Thelma Roell, who studied relationships of dominance and subordination in monkeys and baboons. Roell postulates that a dominant primate might be defined as, quote, one who did not think before it acted, end quote, in encounters with others. A dominant animal walked down a path or sat on a log where it pleased without acknowledging the subordinate's presence. Subordinate animals cringed or scattered at the other's approach. Quote, thus, it was the subordinate animals that cautiously observed and maintained the hierarchy, end quote. Rowell suggested that, quote, the subordinate's behavior elicits dominating behavior rather than the reverse, end quote, in many situations. Quote, cringing, fleeing, and fear grinning, she wrote, are extremely potent stimuli eliciting attack behaviors in primates, and this has rarely taken into account in discussions of hierarchical relationships, end quote. But perhaps the nervous subordinate had good reason to cringe and grin, having sustained a couple of bad bites on prior occasions. Women are not supposed to stand up and fight when they hear the bell. Women smile, they retreat into smaller physical space, and they symbolically offer the neck in appeasement, to use a favorite image of Conrad Lorenz. And from their curled space, they look out at the world around them in a state of alert and watchful tension. Quote unquote women's intuition, that sentimentally valued characteristic, may be nothing more than defensive watchfulness, a picking up and putting together of verbal and non-verbal cues as a strategy of survival, as the subordinate animal is sensitive to the sounds and movements of the dominant animal, which does not need to think before it acts. Subservience in movement and gesture was the hallmark of feminine modesty in books of deportment that were written for the new bourgeoisie of the Middle Ages. Unseemly mirth, a darting eye, a babbling tongue, and a wanton gait were related prohibitions. The good wife instructed her daughter, quote, go thou not too fast, brandish not with thy head, not with thy shoulders cast, end quote. In another volume on manners, a husband advises his wife, quote, go with your head turned straight forward, your eyelids low and fixed. and your gaze before you down to the ground. Turn not your eye on a man or a woman, or staring upward, or laughing, or stopping to talk to anyone in the streets. End quote. When seated, a maiden kept her hands folded quietly in her lap, or busily engaged with needlework. Inhibition was artfully encouraged by restrictive feminine clothing in the centuries that followed. Unable to stretch freely in the confines of her corset, and weighed down by yards of cloth which hampered her step and usurped the use of hand to guide and arrange the sweeping grandeur, a woman of the upper and middle classes was schooled and restrained by social demands of fashion. For street wear, a fanciful hat adorned with ribbons, plumes, and veils served to curtail the motion of her head. Dependence on gentlemen and servants was an understandable consequence of feminine dress. A sturdy woven mesh of local ordinances and municipal codes dictated some further rules of good conduct. Writes American historian Jeffrey Parrott, quote, "Before the First World War, women were arrested for smoking cigarettes in public, for using profanity, for appearing on beaches without stockings, for driving automobiles without a man beside them, for wearing outlandish attire, for example, shorts, slacks, men's hats, and for not wearing their corsets." End quote. Public decency regulations received their strongest support from the Sunday sermons in local churches. Romantically, the feminine ideal is often pictured with something pretty and fragile to occupy the hands: a nosegay of violets, a bridal bouquet of white stephanotis and orange blossoms, a sheaf of long-stemmed roses presented to the prima ballerina as she takes her curtain call amidst applause. With the passing from the social scene of certain dainty props, a fan, a parasol, a wrist corsage from the prom queen, today's customary restraints on bodily comportment are indicated by fingertips and heels, a pocketbook on the shoulder, and a schooled inhibition against spreading the knees. In addition, as the French feminist Colette Guillaumin has noted, women are physically burdened by what she calls quote unquote diverse loads, the habitual signs of chief responsibility for the domestic rule: children on the arm, their food and toys in hand, and a bag of groceries or shirts from the dry cleaners hugged to the chest. Rarely does a woman experience the liberty of taking a walk with empty hands and arms swinging free at her sides. So rare is this, in fact, that many women find it physically unnerving when they do. Unaccustomed to the freedom, they are beset by worries that some needed belonging, some familiar presence, a purse, a shopping bag, has been forgotten. Small, fluttery gestures that betray nervousness or a practiced overanimation are considered girlishly feminine and cute. Toying with a strand of hair, bobbing the head, giggling when introduced, pulling the elbows in close to the body, and crossing the legs in a knee and ankle double twist are mannerisms that men studiously avoid. Self-contained and non-aggressive, they might also almost be the equivalent of cringing, fleeing, and fear-grinning among the lower primates. Jewelry plays a subtle role in delineating masculine and feminine gestures. To drum one's fingers on the table is an aggressive expression of annoyance and conspicuously unfeminine, but to fidget with a necklace or twist a ring in a non-threatening way is a non-threatening way of dissipating agitation. Clutching protectively at the throat is not restricting to females, but corresponding masculine gestures are to loosen the collar and adjust the necktie, actions which indicate some modicum of control. Quaint postures that throw the body off balance, such as standing on one leg as if poised for flight, or leading from the hips in a debutante slouch, or that suggest a child's behavior, the stereotypic sexy secretary taking dictation while perched on the boss's knee, fall within the repertoire of femininity that is alien, awkward, and generally unthinkable as a mode of behavior for men. Reclining odalisque style, a shocker 35 years ago when Truman Capote posed in this manner for a book jacket. As one researcher wrote in Good Humor, quote, trying to define aggression makes people aggressive, end quote. But the rubric generally covers a cluster of behavioral patterns that are usually more pronounced in the male. Expenditure of physical energy, rough house play, irritability, threatening activity in response to fear, inter and intra sex fighting, and the infliction of physical damage. Most students of aggression stretch the definition to embrace territorial defense and the competitive drive for power and dominance within the social hierarchy. The hierarchical order itself is claimed as a product of behavioral aggression, while they shy away from the implications of violence. Few find room in their theories for the phenomenon of maternal aggression, in which a mother utilizes all means at her disposal to protect her young. Despite the vagueness of the aggression concept, the possibility of a hormonal basis for aggressive behavior in human conduct undeniably exists, even with the overriding roles played by hereditary, environmental, and learning in in mediating the complex circuity of the human brain. It would be foolhardy to attempt to gauge the precise extent of that hormonal influence or to claim it as a biological determinant that will continue to affect the destiny of the human race. While testosterone level in human males is 10 times higher than in human females, but the male is not 10 times as hairy, 10 times as muscular, or 10 times as tall. Within a gender, testosterone levels do not correspond to comparative hairiness, muscularity, or height. Yet it is obvious that the endocrine difference between the sexes gave the male an aggression that propelled human endeavor to its present place. War, slavery, the earliest known legal concepts, and the building of monoliths were products of dimorphic masculine strength, more than they were the noble achievements of verbal intelligence, sensitive yearnings, or tactical skills. Only in the last century, and only in those parts of the world where industrial development has rendered brute force somewhat irrelevant, if not thoroughly obsolete, can the question of competitive drive be considered without reference to masculinity, and then only partially with some occupational exceptions. Like all basic behavior, including eating and parental care, aggression in humans is a learned response and a learned inhibition, affected by childhood training, community values, laws, social customs, and religious codes. The psychology of feminine movement, as we know and practice its provocative airs and graces, is based on the premise that direct acts of initiative and self assertion are a violation of the governance of male female relations, if not of nature itself. In place of forthright action, we are offered a vision so exquisitely romantic and sexually beguiling that few care to question its curious imagery of limitations. A Venus de Milo without arms, a mermaid without legs, a sleeping beauty in a state of suspended animation with her face upturned, awaiting a kiss.